Imagine a woman who could neither read nor write her own name, yet she possessed a voice so powerful it shook the foundations of a corrupt government. This is not just a story of a farmer. It is the saga of a revolutionary grandmother who stood her ground against shotguns with nothing but a machete and an unbreakable spirit. Florinda Soriano Muñoz, known to the world as Mamá Tingó, was born into the harsh reality of the Dominican Republic's rural poverty in 1921. Growing up in a society where the deck was stacked against her because of her race and her gender, her early life was defined by the rhythm of the soil. As a young Afro-Latina girl, she didn't have the luxury of a classroom. Instead, her education was found in the seeds she planted and the harvests she reaped. She learned early on that for a peasant, land isn't just property, it is life, identity, and the only shield against starvation. This deep-rooted connection to the earth would eventually transform her from a humble laborer into a titan of social justice. By the time she reached middle age, Florinda had become a pillar of her community in Hato Viejo. She was a mother and a grandmother, a woman whose hands were calloused from decades of toil, but whose heart remained fiercely dedicated to her people. The 1970s in the Dominican Republic was a volatile era where wealthy elites backed by government indifference began systematically seizing land from poor farmers to expand their own estates. While many trembled in the face of such power, Mamá Tingó rose. Despite her illiteracy, she understood the law of justice better than those who wrote it. She joined and eventually led the Federation of Christian Agrarian Leagues, becoming the frontline defender for over 350 families. She didn't lead from a podium, she led from the mud, organizing protests, demanding land titles, and teaching her fellow farmers that their dignity was not for sale. Her presence was so commanding that she became a beacon of hope for the voiceless, proving that the strength of a movement lies not in its funding, but in its conviction. The climax of her struggle arrived in the autumn of 1974. A wealthy landowner named Pablo Diaz claimed the very soil Mamá Tingó had farmed for decades, sending armed henchmen to fence off the property. On the morning of November 1st, after attending a court hearing where she refused to back down, she returned home to find her pigs being released as a tactic to lure her out. When she went to reclaim her livestock, she was confronted by a hired assassin. In a final, cinematic act of defiance, this 52-year-old grandmother stood her ground. Even when faced with a shotgun, she did not run. She fought back with her machete, the tool of her trade and the symbol of her labor, until 2 fatal blasts ended her life. Her blood was spilled on the very earth she died protecting. But in trying to bury her, her enemies only succeeded in planting a seed of revolution. The news of her murder acted as a lightning bolt across the Dominican Republic. The sight of a grandmother being martyred for her land sparked a national outcry so massive that the government, fearing a total uprising, was forced to distribute the contested land back to the 300 impoverished families she had fought for. Even in death, Mamá Tingó won. Today, her name is immortalized in the Santo Domingo metro, in bronze statues, and in the names of schools across the nation. Yet her story is often whispered rather than shouted, hidden by the shadows of classism and anti-blackness that she fought against her whole life. She remains a symbol of the Afro-Latina struggle and a reminder that true power does not come from a pen or a title, but from the courage to stand for what is right. Her life serves as an eternal testament. You can kill the farmer, but you can never kill the spirit of the land she defended. The echoes of the 2 shotgun blasts that took Mamá Tingó's life did not fade into the hills of Hato Viejo. Instead, they grew into a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of the Dominican Republic. When the news of her assassination spread, it wasn't just a community that mourned, it was a nation that woke up. Her death became the spark that set the dry grass of social unrest on fire. Thousands of peasants, students, and activists took to the streets, their voices carrying the name of a woman who had been silenced by lead but reborn in spirit. The sight of her blood on the soil she loved so dearly acted as a mirror, reflecting the systemic cruelty and the deep-seated anti-blackness that had oppressed rural families for generations. the government and the wealthy elites, who had long operated under the assumption that a poor, illiterate black woman could be easily erased, suddenly realized they had created a martyr whose influence was far more dangerous to their corruption than her physical presence had ever been. The pressure became so immense, the public outcry so volatile, that the authorities were left with no choice but to surrender. In an unprecedented victory for the marginalized, the government was forced to legally grant the land titles to over 300 families, the very families Mamá Tingó had lived and died to protect. Her sacrifice bought their freedom, ensuring that the generations coming after her would have a place to call home and soil to call their own. But the legacy of Mamá Tingó transcends the boundaries of the land she defended. It has woven itself into the cultural and political DNA of the Caribbean. To understand her impact is to understand the struggle of the Afro-Latino identity, a narrative often pushed to the margins of history. She became a symbol of the Black mother of the revolution, a figure who proved that intellectualism is not a requirement for leadership. Integrity and courage are. Today, when people board the metro in Santo Domingo at the station named in her honor, or when children walk through the gates of schools bearing her name, they are walking in the shadow of a giant. She is celebrated in folk songs, her image is painted on murals in the barrios, and her life is studied by those who fight for agrarian reform across the globe. Yet her most profound part of her story is the quiet dignity she maintained until her very last breath. She didn't seek to be a hero, she sought to be a provider. She didn't want a statue, she wanted her neighbors to have bread. This humility is what makes her legend so enduring. It reminds us that the most significant changes in history often start with a single person who simply refuses to move. As we look back at the life of Florinda Soriano Muñoz, we see a story that is as much about the future as it is about the past. Her struggle against land grabbing, corporate greed, and systemic racism is a battle that continues in many parts of the world today. She teaches us that justice is not something handed down by the powerful, it is something demanded by the oppressed. Her life challenges the narrative that the poor are passive victims of history. Instead, she showed that they are its most potent architects. In every garden planted by a descendant of Hato Viejo, in every protest for human rights, and in every heart that beats for the marginalized, Mamá Tingó lives on. She is the wind that rustles the sugarcane and the strength in the hands of the modern-day farmer. She taught the world that while a body can be buried in the earth, a cause can never be interred. Her life was a masterclass in resistance, proving that even if you cannot read a book, you can still write history with your life's blood.